The Echo of 1958, Chapter 1, The Portrait and the Stranger. The gallery hummed with a soft, sophisticated murmur, a backdrop of hushed reverence for the art adorning its pristine white walls. Sunlight, filtered through tall arched windows, painted stripes across the polished floor, illuminating dust motes dancing in the quiet air. Evelyn Reed stood beside her portrait, a large, evocative piece that captured her in a moment of profound contemplation. Her silver hair brushed back, her eyes holding a lifetime of stories. The artist, a young prodigy, had perfectly rendered the subtle lines around her eyes, the gentle curve of her lips, and the quiet dignity of her posture. Evelyn, at 63, carried herself with an unassuming grace, a quiet strength that drew people in. She was discussing the intricate play of light in the painting with a curious patron when he appeared, an older gentleman, perhaps in his late 80s, distinguished, with a neat silver coiffure and a tailored tweed jacket. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue, were fixed not on the painting as a whole, but solely on her face within it. There was an intensity in his gaze, a raw vulnerability that made her pause mid-sentence. He approached slowly, his steps measured, a slight tremor in his hand as he reached out, not to touch the canvas, but to hover, as if tracing a memory in the air before her likeness. His voice, when he spoke, was a husky whisper, raspy with age and something far deeper. "Forgive me," he began, his eyes still riveted on the portrait. "But for a moment, I thought she had returned." He finally shifted his gaze to Evelyn, and the blueness of his eyes deepened with a sorrow so profound, so ancient, it stole the breath from her lungs. You are the spitting image of my wife, my Lydia." Evelyn felt a strange chill, a shiver that had nothing to do with the cool gallery air. "I'm Evelyn Reed," she offered, her voice softer than usual. "I posed for the portrait." He nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. "Arthur Blackwood, and your resemblance to my Lydia is astonishing. She died in 1958. The year echoed in her mind, a distant, melancholic chime. It wasn't just the date, it was the way he said it, the utter finality in his tone, yet coupled with the living, breathing image of his loss standing before him. His eyes, now clouded with unshed tears, held hers. There was a desperate plea in them, a longing that bypassed all social convention. Evelyn, who had always guarded her emotions carefully, felt an inexplicable pull towards this stranger. A fragile thread, spun from grief and an impossible resemblance, seemed to connect them. I am so sorry for your loss, Mr. Blackwood," she managed, feeling inadequate, yet deeply moved. He simply nodded again, a flicker of a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. "It's been a long time." "A lifetime, really. But seeing you, it's like a window, a fleeting glimpse of what was." He hesitated, then, with a newfound boldness, asked, Would you consider having coffee with me sometime? There are things, stories, I feel an inexplicable need to share with you." Evelyn, usually reserved, felt an immediate, strong inclination to say yes. It wasn't pity, though she felt that too. It was a curiosity that transcended the ordinary, a feeling that something significant was unfolding, something she was destined to be a part of. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and firm. "I would like that very much, Mr. Blackwood." They exchanged numbers, and he left the gallery, a solitary figure disappearing into the Boston afternoon, leaving behind the silence that felt heavier, imbued with the weight of half a century of unspoken sorrow. Evelyn touched the canvas, her own painted face staring back, and wondered about the woman whose memory she so eerily resembled, Lydia. The name felt strangely familiar on her tongue, as if she had known it in another life. Chapter 2. Echoes in Time. Their first meeting took place a few days later in a quiet cafe in Beacon Hill. The air was thick with the scent of old books and brewing coffee, a comfortable, timeless atmosphere. Arthur arrived promptly, carrying a worn leather satchel. He seemed less overwhelmed than in the gallery, though the underlying current of sorrow was still palpable. Evelyn found herself captivated by his gentle demeanor and the profound depth of his grief. "Thank you for coming, Evelyn," he said, his voice calmer now. He placed the satchel on the table and carefully withdrew a small, ornate photo album. "I brought some pictures of Lydia. I think you'll understand." He opened the album and Evelyn gasped. The first photograph was a black and white snapshot of a young woman, no older than 20, smiling brightly at the camera. Her hair, though dark in the photo, was styled in a similar soft wave to Evelyn's own. Her eyes, even in monochrome, held the same intelligent sparkle, the same gentle arch to her brows. The shape of her face, the curve of her nose, the set of her jaw. It was as if she were looking at herself, 30 years younger, transposed into a different era. She was beautiful, Evelyn whispered, feeling a strange mix of awe and unease. "She was everything," Arthur replied, his voice thick with emotion. He turned the pages, revealing more images: Lydia on a beach, her dress billowing in the wind. Lydia laughing, her head thrown back. Lydia in a simple wedding dress, her eyes shining with happiness, standing beside a younger, beaming Arthur. Each picture intensified the uncanny resemblance, sending a shiver down Evelyn's spine. It wasn't just a strong resemblance, it was almost identical. "We met in 1955, Arthur began, his voice taking on the cadence of a storyteller. "In Knoxville, Tennessee. I was a young architect, just starting out, and she was a school teacher fresh out of college. From the moment I saw her, I knew. It was like a lightning bolt. We married a year later in a small church by the lake." He recounted their love story with a tenderness that brought tears to Evelyn's eyes. Their simple life, their dreams, their plans for a family. He spoke of Lydia's kindness, her sharp wit, her passion for literature, and her infectious laughter. He described their small house, the scent of her favorite flowers, the way she hummed while cooking. Every detail was painted with vivid, aching nostalgia. "Then came 1958, he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "A cold, rainy November night. We were driving home from a dinner party. A truck swerved. It was a head-on collision. I remember the screech of tires, the shattering glass, the impact. Then, darkness. When I woke up in the hospital, they told me she was gone. Instantaneously. He said she didn't suffer." His voice cracked, and he cleared his throat, his gaze distant. "They said it was merciful." He closed the album, his hand lingering on the cover. "I never really recovered. I built my career, I traveled, I had friends, but a part of me died that night with her. And then I saw you." He looked at Evelyn, his blue eyes searching hers. "It's not just the face, you know? It's something in your spirit, a familiar kindness, a resonance." Evelyn listened, her heart aching for him. But beyond the empathy, a deeper, more unsettling feeling was taking root. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper from the recesses of her own memory. She had no clear recollections of her early childhood. She was an only child, adopted at a very young age. Her adoptive parents, loving and kind, had always told her she was found on the steps of an orphanage in Boston, abandoned. They knew nothing of her birth parents, a closed adoption. As was common in those days, "Mr. Blackwood," she began, slowly, "I was adopted. I never knew my birth parents." The words hung in the air, a fragile, unspoken question between them. He blinked, a slow dawning of understanding in his eyes. "Adopted? When?" "In 1959. I was just a baby, maybe 6 months old, according to the orphanage records." The year, the immediate proximity to 1958, a chilling thought, a terrifying possibility began to form in Evelyn's mind. Could it be? Was it possible that the woman in the photographs, the woman who was her exact likeness, was not just a stranger, but somehow connected to her? The coincidence felt too profound, too specific. "Evelyn," Arthur said, his voice barely audible, "do you think—" "No, it's impossible. But the resemblance and the timing—" He trailed off, his mind clearly racing, grappling with the same unthinkable notion. A quiet desperation settled between them. The coffee grew cold, the scent of old books faded, replaced by the ghost of a question that had haunted Evelyn for a lifetime, and now, perhaps, had found its echo in Arthur's own enduring grief. Chapter 3. Whispers of Identity. The encounter with Arthur Blackwood ignited a dormant fire within Evelyn. For years, she had accepted the mystery of her origins. Now, it felt like an urgent, undeniable quest. The photographs of Lydia were etched into her mind, her face a mirror image of Evelyn's own. It was more than coincidence. It felt like destiny. She started her research methodically. She visited the Boston Public Library, spending hours poring over microfilm archives of old newspapers from 1958 and 1959. She searched for articles about fatal car accidents in Tennessee, specifically in the Knoxville area, and then cross-referenced names. Arthur had given her Lydia's full name, Lydia May Henderson. The process was tedious, often frustrating. Many reports were brief, lacking detail. But then, on a sweltering July afternoon, buried deep within the faded pages of a Knoxville Gazette from November 1958, she found it. A small, unspectacular obituary notice. Henderson, Lydia May, 23, died unexpectedly in automobile accident, November 14, 1958. Survived by husband, Arthur Blackwood, and parents, Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Henderson. Services private. A lump formed in Evelyn's throat. It was real. Lydia May Henderson, Arthur's wife. The confirmation, though expected, still hit her with a wave of sadness. But then, a detail snagged her attention. Services private. It struck her as odd. Usually, obituaries mentioned funeral homes, church services, public condolences. Private seemed deliberately vague, almost secretive. She continued her research, delving into birth records, adoption agencies, anything that might shed light on babies adopted in Boston in 1959. The trail was cold. Adoption records from that era were notoriously difficult to access, often sealed for privacy reasons. Evelyn shared her findings with Arthur during their next meeting. He listened intently, his brow furrowed. "Private services," he mused. "Yes, I remember. Her parents insisted. They were always very reserved, isolated even. And they weren't very close to Lydia. Strangely enough, they were more protective of her younger sister, Clara." Younger sister? Evelyn's heart gave a sudden leap. He never mentioned a younger sister. Arthur frowned. No, I suppose not. Clara was much younger, maybe 5 or 6 at the time, a quiet child. Lydia was very devoted to her. Their parents were strict, almost reclusive. They lived on a remote farm outside of Knoxville. Thomas Henderson was a difficult man, very set in his ways. He kept his family close, almost too close. A younger sister, Clara. The thought reverberated in Evelyn's mind. If Lydia had a sister, did that explain the resemblance? No, it didn't. Her resemblance to Lydia was identical. It wasn't a sisterly resemblance, it was a twin's. A new, bolder theory began to crystallize in Evelyn's mind. A terrifying, exhilarating possibility. What if Lydia wasn't an only child? What if the accident was a cover-up? What if Lydia had a twin, born and then separated? And what if that twin was her? She had to find Clara. If Clara existed, she might hold the key. Evelyn searched for Clara Henderson in Knoxville records, but the name was too common. She widened her search, looking for any information on the Henderson family beyond the obituary. It took weeks, navigating through dusty old county records, probate documents, and even contacting historical societies in Tennessee. Then a breakthrough. The distant cousin of Arthur's, a genealogist by hobby, mentioned a long-forgotten family rumor. Thomas Henderson, Lydia's father, had supposedly been involved in some unsavory business dealings. A small-time bootlegger during Prohibition who never quite shed his illicit habits. He was known to have powerful, dangerous associates. And then she found it. An old property deed for the Henderson farm, and another name, listed as a co-owner for a brief period, a Dr. Elias Thorne, a physician from Boston, known for his controversial practices, including facilitating private adoptions. The pieces clicked into place with a horrifying precision. Dr. Thorne, Boston, a private adoption, a hidden sister, a family involved in illicit activities. Evelyn felt a surge of adrenaline, cold and sharp. She had to confront Arthur with her theory. It was wild, unbelievable, but it felt right. It felt like the truth, trying desperately to break through a wall of time and secrecy. Chapter 4. The Unveiling. Evelyn met Arthur at his elegant home, a brownstone in Beacon Hill, filled with antique furniture and the quiet echoes of a life lived. The air was thick with unspoken tension. She laid out her findings, the newspaper clippings, the property deeds, the information about Dr. Elias Thorne. Arthur listened, his face growing paler with each revelation. "Arthur," Evelyn began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "I believe Lydia had a twin sister, and I believe that twin sister was me." Arthur stared at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. A twin? Lydia never mentioned a twin. Perhaps she didn't know, Evelyn countered, or perhaps she was told to keep it a secret. Dr. Thorne was known for facilitating private adoptions, often for families who wanted to keep certain details hidden. If her parents were involved in illicit activities and they had twins, perhaps they couldn't afford to raise two, or perhaps they wanted to protect one from their dangerous world. She continued, the private services for Lydia's funeral, the absence of detail. What if it wasn't Lydia who died in that car? What if it was someone else? A body from a morgue, perhaps, arranged by her father to make it look like his daughter was gone, to protect her from something, or to hide something else entirely. Arthur stood, his hands gripping the back of a mahogany chair, his knuckles white. "No," he whispered. "No, that's impossible. I identified her. I saw her after. It was Lydia. I felt her cold hand." "But Arthur, in a traumatic accident, under immense grief, could you have been mistaken? Could a body have been disguised? Or what if she was heavily bandaged, disfigured beyond easy recognition?" Evelyn pressed, her voice gaining urgency. "It's a long shot, I know, but the resemblance, the timing, the inconsistencies." He paced, his mind clearly reeling. "My God, if what you say is true, then my Lydia, she could be alive." The hope in his voice was fragile, almost painful to witness. But it was there, a spark in the overwhelming darkness. "And if she is," Evelyn continued, "then why did she disappear? Why the elaborate deception? It suggests a very serious threat." They decided to pursue this terrifying, exhilarating possibility. Their first step was to re-examine the accident report. Arthur, with his connections, managed to gain access to the original police files from 1958. The report was brief, citing poor visibility and a swerving truck. The identification of the deceased was attributed to Arthur and a local sheriff. "The sheriff," Arthur muttered. "Sheriff Brody. He retired years ago. He was a good man, but he was also very much under the thumb of Thomas Henderson. Henderson was known for his generosity to local officials." A new line of inquiry emerged: Dr. Elias Thorne and Sheriff Brody. Evelyn focused on Thorne. His practice had been shut down in the early 1960s amidst rumors of unethical practices, but no criminal charges were ever filed. She found a former nurse who had worked for Thorne, now elderly and living in a nursing home in Rhode Island. It took days of polite persistence, but Evelyn finally secured a visit. The nurse, Martha Jenkins, was frail, but her mind was sharp. When Evelyn showed her a photograph of Dr. Thorne, a flicker of recognition, then fear, crossed her face, and she whispered, "I remember," crossed her face. "Dr. Thorne," she rasped, "a dangerous man. He did things for certain people." Evelyn pressed gently. "Do you remember any unusual cases around 1958 or 1959? Specifically adoptions, or anything involving the Henderson family from Tennessee?" Martha's eyes widened. "The Hendersons. Yes, 2 babies, twin girls, born prematurely. The mother was very ill. The father, a very intimidating man. He only wanted one. The other was taken away to be adopted. Dr. Thorne handled it personally." Evelyn's breath hitched. "And the other daughter, Lydia? What happened to her?" Martha paused, her gaze distant, as if reliving a memory. "There was an accident, a car crash. But I heard whispers, not what it seemed. The body, it was badly burned, barely recognizable. Dr. Thorne said it was necessary for certain arrangements. The father, he paid a lot of money to make a problem disappear." "A problem?" Evelyn urged, her voice barely a whisper. "Lydia," Martha said, her voice dropping. "She was involved with someone her father disapproved of, someone dangerous. He said she was a liability. He wanted her out of the picture, made it look like an accident, so she could disappear, start over, away from the family's troubles. But he always said she was gone, like she was dead." The truth, brutal and shattering, slammed into Evelyn. Lydia hadn't died. She had been forced to disappear, to vanish, to become a ghost, her life stolen by her own father's machinations and fear. And the twin, the sister who was never spoken of, had been given away, a baby taken from a family that erased one daughter and banished another. Evelyn was not just a lookalike. She was a survivor of the same brutal deception, a living testament to a family's dark secrets. Her connection to Arthur, to Lydia, was not just fate, it was blood. Chapter 5: The Unseen Life. Evelyn returned to Arthur. The weight of Martha Jenkins' words pressing down on her. Arthur listened in stunned silence, his face a mixture of heartbreak and a terrifying, fragile hope. "So, my Lydia, she's alive?" he whispered, the words barely audible. "All these years I mourned her, and she was out there." "It seems so, Arthur," Evelyn said, her voice thick with emotion. Her father, Thomas Henderson, orchestrated her disappearance. He faked her death to protect her from dangerous connections, likely his own, and to separate her from someone he disapproved of. You. A tear traced a path down Arthur's weathered cheek. My God, the cruelty of it. All those years, she lived with that burden, thinking I was grieving her, thinking she was dead to me. And I, Evelyn added, lived never knowing I had a sister, never knowing my true origins. We were both victims of his control. Their next step was to find Lydia. If she had been forced to disappear, she would have adopted a new identity, a new life, built on a foundation of secrecy. Evelyn realized that Lydia, if she was truly alive, might be in her own early 80s now. It would be a monumental task. They started by piecing together Lydia's life before the accident. Arthur recalled fleeting details: Lydia's love for gardening, her quiet talent for painting landscapes, her fondness for the ocean. He remembered her mentioning a distant aunt who lived in Portland, Maine, a kind woman who had offered Lydia solace during difficult family times. Evelyn, using the limited information, began searching. She looked for any records of women born around 1935 to 1936, who might have changed their names, who might have moved to Maine, who might have shared similar interests to Lydia. It was like searching for a needle in a haystack made of shadows. Weeks turned into months. They hit dead ends. The hope that had initially burned so brightly began to flicker. Arthur, despite his initial surge of energy, was growing weary. The weight of 50 years of grief, and now a fresh wave of uncertainty taking its toll. Evelyn, however, felt an unbreakable bond to this quest. Finding Lydia wasn't just for Arthur, it was for herself. It was about understanding her own past, her own identity. Then an old lead came to light. Arthur remembered Lydia mentioning a small, anonymous art collective she had once been part of, a group of amateur artists who met in a remote cottage to paint landscapes. He vaguely recalled her saying the cottage was somewhere on the coast of Maine. Evelyn widened her search for old art collectives, obscure art groups in Maine. She found a mention in an old art magazine from the 1970s of a small private art community known as the Coastal Canvas, located near a secluded cove outside of Camden, Maine. The article mentioned a woman known only as Rose, whose landscape paintings had an ethereal quality, reminiscent of a bygone era. Rose. The name felt significant. Evelyn contacted the local historical society in Camden. They had records of the old art collective, now defunct. The cottage was still there, privately owned. The article had a small photograph of a woman, her back turned, painting at an easel. Her posture, the way her hair was swept up, it was uncannily similar to Lydia. Evelyn decided to go to Camden. She drove north, the coastal towns blurring into a tapestry of rugged beauty. The cottage was indeed nestled by a secluded cove overlooking the churning Atlantic. It was a simple, weathered wooden structure with a small, meticulously maintained garden, bursting with vibrant hydrangeas, Lydia's favorite flower, as Arthur had described. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Silence. She knocked again. After a long moment, the door creaked open. A woman stood in the doorway. Her hair, now a soft white, was pulled back in a neat bun. Lines of age etched around her eyes. But those eyes, they were Arthur's, Lydia's eyes, and Evelyn's eyes. They were the same startling blue, holding the same depth, the same quiet wisdom. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice soft, with a faint, melodic southern accent. Evelyn swallowed, her throat tight with emotion. "My name is Evelyn Reed. I believe we might be related." She held up a photograph of Lydia, one Arthur had given her from their wedding day. The woman's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening in recognition, then disbelief, then a profound sorrow. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. "Lydia," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the photograph, then shifting to Evelyn, a flicker of something she couldn't quite decipher in her own eyes. "And I believe you are Lydia," Evelyn said, her voice shaking. "And I believe I am your twin sister." The woman's knees buckled. Evelyn reached out, steadying her. "My name is Rose now," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. "But yes, I was Lydia, and you are my reflection." Chapter 6. The Unspoken Years. Evelyn sat with Rose, the woman who was Lydia, in her cozy cottage by the sea. The air was filled with the scent of salt and old oil paint. Lydia, now Rose, offered tea, her hands still trembling. The initial shock had given way to a quiet, profound grief and an overwhelming sense of wonder. "Our father," Lydia began, her voice hoarse, "he was a dangerous man, not just a bootlegger. He was involved with organized crime. In 1958, I stumbled upon something that could have implicated him in a murder. He found out I knew. He knew I wouldn't keep silent, that I'd try to expose him." She paused, taking a deep breath. "He gave me a choice: disappear, or he would ensure both Arthur and I would pay the price. He threatened Arthur, Evelyn. He threatened to frame him, to ruin his life or worse. He said he would make sure Arthur would never know peace if I didn't comply." "So, the accident?" Evelyn prompted, her voice barely a whisper. "He orchestrated it," Lydia confirmed, her eyes distant. "He had a body, a Jane Doe from a local morgue, heavily disfigured in a prior accident. He bribed Sheriff Brody to identify it as me. He made sure the car was unrecognizable. He destroyed all my personal effects, everything that could link me. He made it look real, so horribly real. He told me to adopt a new name, to never contact anyone from my past, to live as if I were dead." "And your twin?" Evelyn asked, the question a raw wound. Lydia's eyes filled with tears. "I never knew. My mother was very ill after our birth. She was told she only had one baby, a girl. My father, he never spoke of it. I found out years later, through old letters, that she had given birth to twins. He had given you away, adopted you through that corrupt Dr. Thorne to protect the family from the perceived burden of 2 daughters. He had convinced himself it was for the best, to keep us safe from his life." Lydia, as Rose, recounted her 50-year odyssey. She had moved to Maine, changed her name, and built a new life, always looking over her shoulder. She became a painter, finding solace in the solitude of the coast. She followed Arthur's career from afar, reading snippets in newspapers, seeing his name in architectural journals. It was an agonizing, silent vigil. She had longed to reach out, to tell him she was alive, but the fear of her father's lingering influence, even after his death years later, had kept her silent. The threats felt too real, too deeply ingrained. Every birthday, every anniversary, she choked out. I thought of him. I imagined him grieving, and it tore me apart. But I truly believed it was the only way to keep him safe. I believed he was better off thinking me dead than being entangled in my father's darkness. Evelyn reached across the small table and took her sister's hand. It was surreal, finding a sister she never knew existed, a mirror image of herself who had lived a life of forced anonymity. The pain of what they had both lost, the years stolen, was immense. But so was the overwhelming joy of finding each other. He always loved you, Lydia, Evelyn said softly. He still does. He never stopped. Lydia's eyes widened, a mixture of hope and fear. Arthur, he knows? He's here, Evelyn confirmed, a small smile playing on her lips. He helped me find you. Chapter 7. The Unfinished Melody. The knock on the cottage door was tentative, hesitant. Lydia, her heart a wild bird in her chest, watched as Evelyn opened it. Arthur stood there, his silver hair wine-swept, his blue eyes filled with an unbearable mixture of trepidation and longing. For a moment, he just stood, looking at her, his vision clouded by 50 years of memory and the impossible reality before him. Lydia, he whispered, his voice cracking, raw with emotion. It wasn't a question, but a profound declaration. Lydia stepped forward, her hand reaching out, trembling. Arthur, she managed, her own voice choked with unshed tears. My Arthur. He closed the distance between them, slowly, as if afraid she would vanish like a dream. He embraced her, a gentle, tender embrace that spoke of decades of yearning. Lydia buried her face in his shoulder, the scent of his cologne, faintly familiar, bringing a fresh wave of memories. She felt the warmth of his body, the steady beat of his heart against hers. It was real. He was real. She was real. They sat for hours, hand in hand, Arthur recounting his half-century of grief, his life lived in the shadow of her perceived death. Lydia, now truly Lydia again, filled in the blanks of her solitary existence, the constant fear, the quiet longing. Evelyn watched, a silent witness to their impossible reunion, feeling a deep, profound sense of belonging she had never known. She was not just an observer. She was the catalyst, the thread that had woven them back together. Lydia explained the fear that had kept her silent, the constant specter of her father's threats, even after his death. She had seen Arthur's name in the news, read about his successes, and had even once, from a distance, seen him walking in a park, gray and older, but still unmistakably him. Each time, the urge to run to him, to reveal herself, was overwhelming, but the instilled fear was stronger. She genuinely believed her death had kept him safe from the dark world her father inhabited. I'm so sorry, Arthur, she whispered, her voice thick with remorse, for all the pain I caused you, for all the years. Arthur gently touched her face. You did what you had to do, my love. You survived, and you are here. That is all that matters. The revelations brought not only joy, but also a complex tapestry of emotions. For Arthur, the grief of 5 decades was replaced by a bewildered, exhilarating happiness, mixed with the sorrow of lost time. For Lydia, the crushing burden of secrecy was lifted, replaced by an overwhelming sense of liberation. Tinged with regret for the choices she had been forced to make, and for Evelyn, the woman who had lived her life without a past, without roots, there was the extraordinary gift of family. A twin sister, a brother-in-law who had loved her sister with an unwavering devotion, a history she never knew she had. The missing pieces of her identity, finally, incredibly, fell into place. The three of them spent the next few days together, sharing stories, laughter, and tears. Lydia, in turn, was overwhelmed by meeting Evelyn, her twin, a living embodiment of her own unknown history. She saw the familiar spark in Evelyn's eyes, the same quiet strength. They spoke of shared interests, similar mannerisms, the inexplicable feeling of being connected even when they didn't know each other. The cottage became a sanctuary, a place of healing. They talked about the future, a future where Lydia would no longer live as Rose, where Evelyn would have a sister, and where Arthur would finally be reunited with the love of his life. It wouldn't erase the past, the lost years, the pain, but it would allow them to build a new chapter, one filled with honesty, forgiveness, and the profound, enduring power of family found. Chapter 8. A Tapestry of Beginnings. Life for Evelyn, Arthur, and Lydia became a beautiful, if sometimes bittersweet, tapestry of new beginnings. Lydia slowly re-entered the world, shedding the skin of Rose. Though she kept the name for her art, she reveled in the simple joys she had denied herself for so long. Sharing meals with Arthur, holding his hand, taking walks along the beach without the constant fear of being discovered. Her art, once tinged with melancholy and solitude, now bloomed with vibrant colors and a newfound lightness, reflecting the joy she finally allowed herself to feel. Arthur, invigorated by Lydia's return, found a renewed zest for life. The emptiness that had gnawed at his soul for 50 years was finally filled. He looked at Lydia and saw not just the young woman he had loved, but the resilient, strong woman she had become. Their love, though interrupted by decades of deception, had proven itself unbreakable, transcending time and circumstance. They remarried in a small private ceremony by the ocean, Evelyn as Lydia's maid of honor, a silent vow to reclaim the years stolen from them. Evelyn, too, found a profound sense of peace. The haunting question of her origins, the void in her past, was finally filled. She had a sister, a connection that felt as natural and essential as breathing. She and Lydia discovered a shared love for painting, spending hours in Lydia's studio, comparing techniques, sharing stories. Evelyn found herself drawing on the deeper well of emotion that her newfound history had unearthed, her own art becoming more nuanced, more expressive. They spoke often of the why Thomas Henderson had made such extreme choices. They uncovered more details through old legal documents and whispers from distant relatives. His fear of criminal retribution, his misguided attempts to protect his family from his own dangerous life, even if it meant destroying their happiness. His actions, while unforgivable, were driven by a twisted sense of paternal duty, a desperate attempt to control a world he couldn't grasp. Forgiveness was a long and arduous process, but understanding began to pave the way. The three of them forged a unique family unit. They shared holidays, celebrated birthdays, and simply spent quiet afternoons together, content in each other's presence. There were moments of quiet sorrow for the lost years, for the children Lydia and Arthur never had, for the childhood Evelyn had spent alone. But those moments were always tempered by the profound gratitude for what they had found: a second chance at connection, a family reunited against all odds. Evelyn's initial encounter with Arthur at the gallery, a seemingly random event, had spiraled into a revelation that reshaped all their lives. It was a testament to the fact that some threads of destiny, however fine, however stretched across time, refused to break. The echo of 1958, once a mournful lament, had transformed into a symphony of hope, forgiveness, and the enduring power of love that, even when buried, never truly dies. Lydia, the woman who was a portrait of a memory, was now a living, breathing reality, not just for Arthur, but for the sister she never knew she had. And in their reunion, Evelyn found not just her past, but a future filled with the warmth of an embrace she had unknowingly longed for her entire life.